One of the things I get asked about the most is color. How do I choose my color? Honestly, it's never a perfect straight line process. It's more of a bit of a wandering path, switching things up as I go with a lot of rethinking and probably overthinking, and sometimes it looks downright chaotic. But the best way to explain this is perhaps to show you. So in today's video, I thought I'd bring you behind the scenes and walk you through how I choose the colors for one of my most popular blanket designs, the little fusion blanket in my country garden color palette. I'll share the twists and turns of my decision making from start to finish and tie it all back to the 7 color tips from my crochet color play series. The cool thing is there isn't a real order to these tips. They overlap and weave back and forth throughout the entire process of the project. But basically I do start with inspiration and I end with the layout. But in between there's a lot going on and in no specific order. So let's dive in and I'll attempt to walk you through how I use these color tips in a practical and real example. I'm describing this from a finished project perspective, so a lot of decisions are made from trial and error as I work through the project, but I'll try to make sure I don't forget these parts as I explain this process to you. I've listed the colors with their brand info for this project in the description below, and you can find the complete 25-page PDF for this blanket in my shop. And it includes all the diagrams, charts, colorways for all 90 squares, and the written out join-as-you-go instructions for assembly. And of course, you can find the little fusion square tutorial itself here on my YouTube channel. So let's get started with tip number 1, which is color and inspiration and where to begin. This blanket came from a desire to capture that old English country garden feel, that late summer stage with the full blooms of the wildflowers, as well as the architecture and colors of the stonework and surrounding landscape. It's kind of like one of those puzzles with the 2,000 pieces, and it has all the colors of the garden plus the stonework in there, and there's so much fun to put together. You know, you get the idea of where I'm going here. I started with a wide range of colors that I thought might work. Pinks, greens, reds, beiges, and everything that I had that worked within those ranges. This is where my sample color squares come in handy because I don't always have all the colors I've worked with on hand, and it is easier to work with these squares than a bunch of yarn balls because that can get cumbersome and really quite messy. So I sit with these colors, laying them out and coming back to them over and over, sometimes for a few days or a few weeks, just to see what catches my eye. I slowly narrow it down and I try to get it to about the 10 to 12 color mark because if you know me, you know I like to use a lot of color. If I go over that, I seem to find it gets too busy. And if I go under that, I feel like something's missing. I'd already decided I want to use my little fusion square, but honestly, sometimes I have a few squares in mind and I'll work a couple up in the colors to decide which square I want to use. But in this case, I worked a few samples with the little fusion because I'd already decided on it to see how the colors worked together. Depending on the square design, not all color palettes will fit, so I find it important to do what I call auditioning the design itself with the color palette that you've chosen. So from my initial colors, I started to work on the square, but I decided the pinks were too bright and I eliminated most of them. But I did keep the terracotta as it is a more muted color, and I also like the richness of the ginger, but it wasn't too bright in the reds. But I needed more balance on the red side as well, so as I worked the squares, I realized that, and that's when I brought in the caramel color because I felt like it balanced the ginger and the terracotta. I also wanted a bit more range in the greens. I did want a lot of greens because it's a garden, and I discovered a new deeper green while I was out shopping one day. I went out for groceries and I came back with yarn, so I brought that one in as well. So I had it down to 9 colors and 2 neutrals, but you'll see I added in a third neutral as I ran out of the one I was going to use for the join. That brought it up to 12 colors total. So this was my final palette. As I work you through the next tips, you'll see how I came to this palette. The palette kind of evolved depending on what I was looking for with those tips as well. So moving on to tip number 2, we're moving into mood. And obviously the mood is going to help me choose my color palette. So keeping in mind this is not a linear process, even though I'm describing it in retrospect this way, the color palette evolves throughout these other tips as well. So mood is basically about feeling good about the colors and deciding if they fit the story that I'm trying to tell. This blanket was telling a story of curling up in the late summer, early fall as nature shifts the seasons under a cozy blanket with a cup of coffee or tea and feeling like I'm in an old English country garden with all its color and history. And for me, I try to include colors and textures in my stories. I wanted the eclectic quilt feel with small squares of many colors, creating one big colorful piece. And in the end, the join color and stitch I use works into this as well, as it created the lattice work structure for all these little pieces in my country garden. So moving on to tip number 3, which is about neutrals. When I make my blankets and squares, I like to use the neutrals to help make the colors stand out. And I find the stitch texture shows up nicely on the lighter colors as well. So I also use them to join the squares, not always, but a lot of the time, so that the other colors have room to breathe. One of my neutrals here is Almond, and I use this one only in the inner rounds as it gave a bit more depth. But I did not use it on the final squaring round as I felt it was too light and it wouldn't stand out against my join color, which was linen. I was going to use this linen as the floral element and also for the join, but I ran out of it. So I brought in an Aran, which was very close, but it gave just a bit more depth as the colors are slightly different shades of each other. So the linen stayed as the floral element and the Aran became the join. So now I'm going to roll into tip number 4, which will also roll into tip number 5. So tip number 4 is repetition. Tip number 5 is shape. They kind of work together here. So I decided to use the linen, which is one of my neutrals, in the same round in every square. It created a bit of a blossom look, and I was going for that floral look being a country garden. And this brought out an element of the square that gave me what I was looking for. By using the neutral in round 4 on every square, it gives me breathing space to use as much color as I like on the rest of the blanket. The repeating neutral on each square is the thing that draws your eye around the blanket and gives it a cohesive feel, making the other colors kind of mingle together as an eclectic background. So now tip number 5 is shapes, and we're going to continue on with the whole idea here of the floral. This tip works in partnership with the repetition. The neutral color gives the floral shape to the square, creating that garden feel when you put them all together. It doesn't necessarily have to be the representation of the petals. It could be the light reflecting off the petals. It could be the dew sitting on the petals. It just kind of gives you that feel like this shape is a flower. So as I mentioned before, I could have used a different round to emphasize what I was going for here, but I chose round 4. So I let the center then be a strong emphasis color, and then round 2 and 3 were just hints of colors that played off of it, and then of course 4 is the neutral, and round 5 was the squaring round, a nice bold color to frame the flower. So now we're on to tip number 6, color mixing, which we kind of hinted at earlier. I like to keep all my colors balanced, so I'll mix up the colors in the squares, trying to have equal amounts of all colors except the neutrals throughout the blanket. So I do this by starting with the centers, making equal amounts of each color. So this blanket had 90 squares total, and eventually I landed on 9 colors for the outer squares. So 9 colors for the round 5. But with the almond I was using on the inner, I had 10 colors for the centers. See how I get complicated there? I do this to myself. So that meant 90 squares divided by the 10 colors for the centers would be 9 centers of each of the colors. Then I let myself play with the contrast combos I liked on rounds 2 and 3 because not all colors could sit beside each other nicely. So I don't always completely rotate these colors. And because there's so little of them, I might use more of one than another. And then round 4 was the linen on every square, and that created my floral effect. And finally, I had 9 colors I wanted to use on the outer round. So not the almond that I used in the center because I didn't think it would stand out very well against the linen. So that changed things up, and now I needed 10 squares of each color. Sometimes I work a batch of squares all the way to the last round, and other times I work the same round on each one and do a batch of those. This is just my brain needing to mix things up and keep me interested because there are 90 squares going on here. But in general, I ended up with an even balance of colors in the blanket. So this takes us to tip number 7, the last one, which is the layout. So when I do my layouts, I like to determine how I'm going to join my blanket. And I usually try a sample join with just 9 squares. That's like a pillow top size. And it gives me a good idea of what the blanket's going to look like. First, I did it with my regular join as you go. And then I tried another one with a slip stitch version of the join as you go just for fun. And I really liked the texture that the slip stitch gave it. Again, I was trying to bring texture into this because of the architecture and the stonework. So I was leaning toward the slip stitch version, but was feeling like it needed a little more space between the squares, as they're pretty solid little squares. I needed some flow and space to lighten up my blanket. So I go experimenting and deciding to add extra chain spaces into the mix, but keep that slip stitch idea idea. I ended up with what looked like a latticework texture between the squares. So a happy accident there because it gave me the old world garden feel I was going for. Now that I have all the squares done, I finally get to lay everything out. This is the fun part. To assemble this blanket, I decided to use the join as you go method. So I do my thing where I lay them all out in the final blanket layout. I move them around until I'm happy with them. This could take a little while. And then once I have them the way that I want, often I'll take a picture because it's amazing how quickly they can get mixed up, especially if your cat lands on them. Now, I forgot to take a picture of my country fusion process where I did this, so I'll show you my meadow blossom blanket. I did the same process for that one. So basically I use rings to keep the rows organized, placing the squares in the order that I'll be joining them, 1 row per ring. This keeps me organized and then I can relax into the joining process. I have explained that ring method in some of my other videos, so I won't go into that here. But basically, once I have them all on their rings, I'm ready to join my blanket and I'm good to go. And finally, I'll be adding a border to it. And I always experiment with different borders, and that's just a whole nother tutorial on borders. So that's a little peek into my process as I work through this blanket. It's never a perfectly smooth journey, ever, and I give myself plenty of room for trial and error, taking breaks, ripping out stitches, or letting things sit for a few days or weeks before coming back. I hope seeing my process gives you some inspiration and confidence as you tackle your next project. And if you'd like to see even more of my creative journey and color experiments, come over and check out my Patreon. I'd love to share more with you. Thanks so much for joining me on this little behind the scenes adventure. I'd love to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments what part of the process you found most helpful. So until next time, happy crocheting.